All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for Behavioral Economics, Understanding What Actually Motivates Your Workforce Instead of What Should, sponsored by ADP and presented by Jordan Birnbaum. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you that this webcast has been pre-approved for HRCI credit and can also be used for SHRM credit. Please be sure to attend the complete webcast in order to receive your credits. After the webcast, you'll receive an email from HR.com within 1 to 2 business days that will include your certification credit information. You can also log into HR.com and go to your View My Credits page where you can see the credits that you've received. If you have any questions today for Jordan or for HR.com, please type them into the Questions tab on your GoToWebinar control panel, which you'll typically find up at the top right-hand corner of your screen, and we'll be sure to follow up with you. It's my pleasure now to turn you over to Jordan Birnbaum.
Hi, everyone. I just wanted to wave a quick hello to say hi before we get started, and I will then take my face off of the screen because the hello is all you needed. What I wanted to say first and foremost is thank you so much for being here. We're thrilled to be here with you and to talk about one of my favorite subjects, behavioral economics, and hopefully in addition to giving a good fundamental understanding of what behavioral economics actually is, we can also provide some insight into how HR practitioners can use behavioral economics to achieve better outcomes with all sorts of HR initiatives, including specifically understanding how best to motivate the workplace. So before we get started, I just want to address the picture up on your screen. You might be wondering, why is there an image of an audience that is laughing and clapping? And the answer is because I'm priming you to find everything I say from this point on to be utterly delightful. So we'll see at the end of the session whether or not my little ploy worked. So I'd like to start off with an apology that we're going to be beginning with the most boring slide of the entire presentation. But it turns out that oftentimes to describe behavioral economics, it's a really good idea to start by describing classical economics. And what matters for us here to understand is that classical economics is essentially about making predictions. Economists build models, they put various pieces of information into their models, and it spits out various predictions. And this can be very simple and then grow into being incredibly complex and obviously hugely important. But what a lot of people don't realize is that for those models to work, economists have to make certain assumptions. And sometimes those assumptions can be a little bit problematic when it comes to the real world. So in particular, I'd like to draw your attention to assumption number 3, the assumption in classical economics that all human beings are perfectly rational actors. Now, of course, I don't mean to make too much fun of our young friend here, but he has clearly vastly overestimated the size of his swimming pool. I think you'll all join me in saying, better luck next time, young fella. But hopefully we've proven the point that human beings are not perfectly rational actors, at least not all the time. Which leads us to the question. Sylvie, if you could launch the first poll question. How do you define behavioral economics? Is it the study of rational behavior? Is it the study of irrational behavior? Is it how behavior affects economic modeling? Or is the answer, I do not know, that is why I'm here? So let me first say that answer D is totally acceptable. It makes a lot of sense, but actually the correct answer is B. It's the study of irrational behavior. So let's move forward and see if we can help explain why that is the case. So unlike with classical economics, which looks at how people ought to behave if they're being driven by rational self-interest, behavioral economics is instead about how people should behave. And as a result, we consider it to be the would over the should. How would people behave as opposed to how should they behave? And because of this, behavioral economics is actually much more the study of psychology than it is the study of economics. And this is why it's sometimes referred to as the science of irrationality. We're going to talk a lot more about what do we mean by irrationality, because it's a big word and it has different nuanced meanings, and it's not necessarily what you think it is. So before we start getting into, well, what do we mean by the science of irrationality, I just want to reiterate that these are the assumptions of classical economics that we're abandoning, that we're saying these do not apply. We don't believe that human beings are perfectly rational, or that they have endless willpower, or that they are perfectly selfish even in that regard. So hopefully that piques a little bit of interest, and let's get into some examples of specifically what we're talking about. The framing effect is one of the first examples of behavioral economics, because it demonstrates to us how identical information presented in different ways can lead to very different outcomes. So let's imagine that you're a doctor sitting with a patient, and you have just learned that the patient has contracted a disease, a very serious disease. Now, you could choose to communicate this with the patient in one of two ways. You could say, you have contracted this disease, and you should know that there is a 90% survival rate for people who get this. Or you could say, you have contracted this disease, and you should know that there is a 10% mortality rate for people who conceive this. Now, a 90% survival rate and a 10% mortality rate is the exact same thing. And yet people, when presented with those two statements, will respond very differently. One will elicit feelings of optimism, while the other will elicit feelings of pessimism. And it turns out that's actually really important in predicting how people are going to behave in the aftermath. So it's extremely important that we realize that how we present information is going to have a huge impact on what happens with it. It's the reason why you'd be really happy to buy something at the supermarket that's 80% fat-free, but you'd be really hesitant to buy something that's 20% fat. Now, this is not unreasonable, but it is irrational, because the same information should affect us the same way regardless of how it's presented to us. So that gives you a first sense of how the framing effect can influence how we perceive the same information, and a little bit of the nuance of irrationality. So here we're going to share a fun experiment by one of the giants of behavioral economics, Dr. Dan Ariely. And he intended to set out to show how irrelevant information can then influence us. And so to do so, he conducted a really clever experiment. He started out by addressing large groups of people and saying, I want you to assume that you've decided that you're going to subscribe to The Economist. You have two pricing choices. If you want to access it online only, it's $59 a year. But if you'd like to access it online and have a print version delivered to your house, that's going to be $125 a year. And he ran this often enough that he could establish a baseline of how appealing these options were generally to people. But then he did his experimental group, and this time he introduced a third pricing option, which you'll see in the middle, which is print only for $125 a year. Now, you're probably thinking to yourself, that's stupid, and you're right. Why would anybody ever choose print only for $125 a year when they could also get online and print for the same price? So it might even seem like it's a mistake, but let's take a look at how people's choices were influenced. So now in this new scenario, only 16% of people opted for online only. Nobody went for the ridiculous offer, but suddenly 84% of people were choosing online and print. So that's a pretty significant difference. And if you're the economist and you make more money by selling print subscriptions, this is probably a really important thing to know. But demonstrating how irrelevant information can actually affect our choices would be another example of irrationality. Simply by putting up print only at $125 a year makes online and print at the same price seem like a really good deal, and it's harder for people to pass that up. Nonetheless, that's a little irrational. Okay, this is another classic example from another one of my heroes, Dr. Daniel Kahneman. It's affectionately known as the Linda problem. So let's just take a look together at what the experience is like. Linda is 31 years old, single, outspoken, and very bright. She majored in philosophy. As a student, she was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice. and she participated in pro-environmental demonstrations. So, knowing what we know about Linda, which of the following two alternatives is more probable? That Linda is a bank teller, or that Linda is a bank teller and active in the feminist movement? Now, if you're like me and 85% of the other people who have been shown this problem over the years, you said it's more likely that she's a bank teller and active in the feminist movement. And if you're like me, you're wrong. The correct answer is number one. Linda is a bank teller. And the reason it's number one is because of something called conjunction fallacy, which we all committed. It is literally impossible for two things together to be more likely than any one thing happening on its own. So by getting this other information about Linda, it led us to make a mistake when assessing the probabilities of what she does. Now, it might seem like, well, affecting the evaluation of probability is only a limited sphere of influence, but in reality, every decision that we ever make at every moment of the day comes down to assessing probabilities. So this can give you a sense of how irrelevant information can lead us into making some flawed choices. And so that's another example of irrationality. Okay, now we're going to talk about a really compelling behavioral economics tactic, which involves the default option. The default option, generally speaking, is what happens when people do nothing. So oftentimes, if you've installed software, as you're going through the motions, it always leaves you with a default option. You can choose to not go with the default option, but if you just keep clicking next, it'll take you through, and that's what the default is. Now, it turns out the default option is unbelievably powerful. And to demonstrate that, we're going to use an example of organ donation rates in Germany and in Austria. Now, part of what makes this such a compelling example is that the cultures in Germany and Austria are extremely similar. So it would be very surprising to learn that they have wildly different opinions or attitudes about organ donation rates. But what they do very differently is how they use the default option in signing up to be organ donors. So in Germany, they use an opt-in method. What that means is that when you go to renew your license, there's a box, and you have to check that box in order to become an organ donor. So you have to opt in. You have to choose proactively to be in as an organ donor. And as a result, Germany has about a 12% sign-up rate for organ donation. Austria, on the other hand, takes an opt-out approach. So in Austria, when you go to renew your license, you have to check a box if you do not want to become an organ donor. If you do nothing, you become an organ donor. Now, of course, it's important that they make the choice very obvious and very easy to do, but nonetheless, this is how it works in Austria. So you want to guess what the organ donation sign-up rate is in Austria? It's bigger than you think, 99%. So the takeaway here, I suppose, is that if you ever need an organ, it's a good time to plan a trip to Austria. But more than that, it's that how we set our defaults for participation in programs can be the difference between success and failure. And because I often talk about this in the United States, I find that people are usually interested to know, well, how does it work over here? And in the US, unfortunately, we follow an opt-in approach. And so even though 85% of us express an intention to become organ donors, only 28% of us actually follow through. Of course, I am trying desperately to get in touch with somebody at the DMV and tell them about how important it is that we switch this. So if any of you have friends at the Department of Motor Vehicles, please give them a call and say, let's switch to an opt-out for organ donation in the US. Finally, I'm going to preview to an answer on why behavioral economics matters for HR practitioners by talking about retirement savings programs. Over the aughts, since the 90s, a lot of companies have moved to 401k participation, becoming an opt-out as opposed to an opt-in proposition. In other words, employees have to check a box if they don't want to participate in a 401k program. And it has made a huge difference. Just to demonstrate that, Fidelity recently released a study that looked at retirement savings practices of people aged 21 to 30. The idea here is these are the people least likely to be worried about retirement. And when they offered an opt-in program, they got about a 20% sign-up rate. But when they offered it via opt-out, it was a 76% sign-up rate. So that made a major difference. So hopefully this demonstrates how the default option and opt-out participation can dramatically affect the outcomes. Okay, this is a fun quirk of psychology about how human beings react to choices. It turns out that we value the freedom to make our own decisions more than anything else. And that explains why when you say to your teenage daughter, under no circumstances are you to date that boy, all you've done is made it certain that she is going to want to continue to date that boy. Not because she likes the boy, but because the freedom to choose for herself is the most important thing. And so she will actually embrace a decision that she may not even like just to assert that autonomy. So what we have to realize as practitioners is that every time we communicate in the form of a command, we're actually unconsciously encouraging people to do the exact opposite. So when public policy initiatives have tried to address littering, when they say to people, don't litter, they actually produce more littering. The worst way to get someone to stop smoking is to say, don't smoke. When you do that, in fact, you drive up people's smoking. And finally, the best way to make sure that everybody wants to read a book is to censor it. So anytime that people feel that their ability to choose for themselves is being threatened, they will do whatever they can to reassert that authority. But on the flip side of this is the BYAF technique called But You Are Free. This was discovered by social scientists in France. They went into a shopping mall dressed as panhandlers, and they went around and asked people for change for bus fare. And they did it often enough that they felt that they had a representative average of how often people would actually comply or would provide them with money and how much money they would get. And so they established those averages, and then they started their experiment where they did the exact same thing, only this time, every time they made the request, they said, but you are free to decline. And when they added the words, but you are free, the frequency with which people gave money doubled, and the amounts of money they gave doubled. So this idea of merely highlighting an individual's freedom to choose makes them much more likely to want to agree to whatever it is that you're asking. And so this has now been replicated and validated, I think, more than 50 times in peer-reviewed journals. There has been meta-research done proving that it works, and there have been initiatives in driving donations, sales, signatures, and getting volunteers, all of which have outperformed when using the words, but you are free to choose. Okay, now we're going to take a look at different ways that our brain reacts to some challenging situations. So even though you may have been promised there would be no math in this presentation, I'm going to ask you to bear with me for just a minute, and let's take on this problem together. Okay, so combined, a bat and a ball cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? So I'll give everybody a couple of minutes to figure out an answer in your head. And by a couple of minutes, I actually mean a couple of seconds. And so hopefully you guys have come up with your first answer. And I'm guessing a lot of you came up with 10 cents as the answer, as did I the first time I ever saw this problem. Of course, once again, we are wrong. And hopefully that math will make it clear why. The correct answer is actually a nickel. If the ball costs a nickel and the bat costs $1 more than the ball, it's $1.05. Add them together and you get to $1.10. Now, the reason that this is so interesting is that because for those of us that did answer 10%, we actually just engaged in an activity known as the substitution heuristic. In other words, heuristic is a mental shortcut. And when we were confronted with a slightly complex problem and had a little bit of time pressure to come up with an answer, as a coping mechanism, we substituted a complicated question with a simpler one. And so those of us who came up with the answer of 10 cents, the question we were answering is, what's $1.10 minus $1? And so I share this just to give you a sense of how our brains are sometimes leading us down the wrong path in an effort to make things easier for us. And the last thing I just want to point out is that anytime you read about this study, they're always certain to make sure that they let us know that more than 50% of these very smart students get the problem wrong. So we can all feel a little bit better about ourselves. Okay, loss aversion is, I don't have a specific example or exercise here, but it's such a cool concept that I couldn't ignore it. So I'll just describe it, which is to say that human beings are literally twice as motivated to avoid a loss as we are to secure a gain. Losses hit us twice as powerfully as gains. Even though the emotions are in the opposite direction, the impact of a loss is twice as powerful as the impact of a gain. I just think this is a really interesting quirk of human nature, and it's interesting to think about from an evolutionary perspective how we may have ended up this way. But just to cut to the quick, how is this relevant for HR practitioners? I'll give an example that I often use. If I'm trying to get leaders to engage in leadership development, I could say, think of all the career advancement that you stand to gain by improving as a leader. Or I could say, think of all the career advancement that you stand to lose by not improving as a leader. And one of those statements is twice as motivating. So that's how you can start to use this understanding of loss aversion to drive various HR outcomes. Okay, if there is one sort of connective thread throughout all of behavioral economics that makes all of these different things start to make a little bit more sense, it's this. Our brains are limited. Of course, we're incredible. Look at all we've achieved as a species. So I'm not here to insult our capacities, but I will say that there are severe limitations on what we're able to do with our brains. And in fact, there are fields of study that consider nothing else about how we are limited. So the idea of bounded rationality looks at how in every decision we are in less than perfect circumstances to make the best possible decision. We might not have full information, we might be under time pressure, we might be tired. Cognitive load talks about how the brain can only take in so much information at once before it becomes useless. Ego depletion talks about how we have to exert energy over the course of our day just to control our impulses, and that as we lose energy, we become less able to control those impulses, and it affects our behavior. So as a result, there are sort of lots of different coping mechanisms that we have created. They work well enough because we've survived, but they also lead to systematic errors that are now, fortunately for us, somewhat predictable. And so we can anticipate them and start to understand how we can help people to overcome some of these inherent challenges. Lastly, I feel that any discussion about behavioral economics has to bring up the book Nudge. It is written by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein. Professor Thaler recently won the Nobel Prize. So for all of us in behavioral economics, it was a really big deal. But this book is probably the most important in nurturing this explosion of interest in the field of behavioral economics. And the high points of this book is that most people are not really thinking when they're making decisions, and that's the idea of mindless choosing. In addition, it is literally impossible to offer an unbiased choice. No matter how we structure choices, there's always going to be a bias towards one action or the other. And so Thaler and Sunstein argue that since we are now choice architects, when we're designing these choices, that we should subscribe to a theory of libertarian paternalism. The libertarian means you have to let people be free to choose for themselves, but the paternalism means since you're going to be biasing the choice, bias it in favor of that which serves the interest of the chooser. It's a really fun book. If you find this stuff interesting, I really encourage you to read it. It's not a hard read, and it's incredibly enlightening. All right, Sylvie, we're coming up on the next poll question. So poll question number 2. we are going to ask, BE is important for, and is it orgs, leaders, managers, HR executives, or all of the above? Thank goodness everybody is coming in at all of the above, because that means that I have done, well, not everybody, but most of us are coming in at all of the above, which means that I have gotten the message across that I was hoping to get. So yes, BE is important for all of this stuff. So thank you for that. Okay, so why should we care? And when I say we, I mean HR. And again, I'm going to bring up this concept of we're putting would over should. So when we think about human resources interventions, we're not trying to predict anymore how people should respond, but rather how people would. So let's just take a look, especially from a talent and a human side. Let's take a look at what some of the more important applications are within the HR sphere of influence. And so consider employee engagement, something that we're going to look at a little more deeply later in the presentation. So if we're trying to understand what we can do to improve employee engagement, then essentially we're making predictions about how people are going to react to various things that we put out there to hopefully improve their engagement. Clearly, being able to accurately predict those reactions is going to go a long way towards determining whether we are successful or unsuccessful in moving the needle on employee engagement. Learning and development, I think, is always a very difficult problem. Most people will tell you that they want to learn and that they want to develop. HR practitioners over the years have created some of the most amazing learning and development websites that has incredible content, incredible functionality, incredible design. And then what happens? Nobody ever uses them. And it's through no fault of the website design or the HR practitioner. It's the fault of the human condition. It's just how people are wired. Selection. I think it's become pretty common knowledge now that most hiring decisions are driven by personal biases, and that they, in fact, lead to really poor hiring decisions. And so certainly an aspiration of HR is to try to help people make better choices about who to hire. And then, of course, performance appraisal, maybe the most complicated and trickiest of all endeavors within an organization. How do you provide constructive feedback and evaluate people without killing their motivation, without killing their self-esteem, and without ruining the relationships between management and their teams? And how do we try to impact these outcomes? Well, we do it through how we communicate, what messages we communicate, how we frame these communications. We do it through how do we design our programs, how do we structure our training, how do we run our change management. In all of these scenarios, we need to be able to accurately predict how people are going to respond to these things if we want to drive them towards success and our organizations towards success. So hopefully the importance of being able to accurately predict people's behaviors starts to become clear as we consider the direct applications within the HR world. And this is a concept that I think that a lot of HR practitioners actually really like. It's when I acknowledge that behavioral economics has been a part of HR since before the term behavioral economics ever existed. So in fact, there's tremendous overlap between behavioral economics and industrial and organizational psychology. And IO psychology, of course, is considered the science behind HR. And there are two HR interventions that I want to call out because to me, they are the ultimate behavioral economics interventions, and they have been around since before the term behavioral economics existed. So the first such example is of structured interviews. I'm guessing most of you are familiar, but just in case, a structured interview is a process whereby I, as an interviewer, have a set of fixed questions, and I am going to ask the exact same questions to every single candidate that I interview. And I'm also going to have a very clear evaluation method for how I consider and grade those responses. And the reason that we do this is because this helps me to overcome my personal biases, and it helps me structure interviews and evaluations in ways that are going to help me make better objective decisions. Now, the impact of structured interviews is beyond dispute. The most recent study I saw said that people's hiring decisions are 6 times more effective than unstructured interviews. So clearly, following this pattern leads to much better outcomes, but it is specifically designed to anticipate human fallibility and to counter it ahead of time to help people get to better outcomes. So structured interviews are the ultimate example of behavioral economics. Another is adult learning theory. Over the 100 years or so of IO psychology, people have been trying to understand how best to teach for a variety of reasons. There are all sorts of positive outcomes that come with learning. But over the years, there were a lot of struggles. And part of what people were struggling with was understanding, like, how do we get adults to learn? And it turned out we were going wrong because we assumed that learning in adults was the same as learning in kids. And they're very different. In fact, with adults, it turns out that if you want them to learn anything, the first thing you have to do is make the case successfully for why it's worth it for them, why it's worth it for them to put in the time and to care about learning something. And that if you fail to do that, you're not going to be driving learning in adults at all. So again, this is looking beyond what should motivate people and instead focusing on what would. So with that, Sylvie, we're going to go to the next poll question. And this time, we're about to pivot from HR practice in general into the specific question of employee engagement. And so now we're just hoping to get a sense of how are your organizations looking at employee engagement? How are your organizations trying to recognize or approach it? And I see, oh, wow, a lot of variation, a lot of distribution there. We're going to be talking about all of these different interventions in a moment, but thank you for your answers. It looks like recognition tools are the most popular, and that's good because they're also my favorite. Okay, so moving into BE and employee engagement. So before we start, let's make sure that we're all on the same page or have the same definition of what employee engagement means. And so for our purposes, we're going to say that employee engagement measures the commitment of an individual employee to the organization's success. And it turns out that when employees are committed to an organization's success, a lot of really good things happen. And so from that regard, let's just first establish, why does employee engagement matter? And let's go through it. The most recent research, this coming from Gallup, shows us that organizations with engaged employees are 21% more profitable, 17% more productive, have 10% higher customer satisfaction metrics, 59% lower turnover, absenteeism is 41% lower, safety, there's 70% fewer incidents, and even innovation. Organizations with engaged employees provide their customers with 61% more new ideas. I feel that something like employee engagement has historically been viewed as a nice to have. Wouldn't it be nice to be able to do this for your employees? But thanks to data, it seems pretty clear that actually employee engagement is a need to have. These metrics on the screen are what all of our C-suite executives are focused on day in and day out. And perhaps the most impactful thing that we can do to improve these metrics is focus on employee engagement. And fortunately, the data is telling that point very clearly. So, sounds important. I'm guessing that companies are focused and having great success with engagement. Unfortunately, the answer to that is nope. In fact, 2 out of every 3 employees in the US are not engaged. Rather, I would say that their attitudes at work could be summarized thusly. And so whenever you're looking at results like this, where 2 out of every 3 are unengaged, we need to consider, what is it that we're doing? And when we say what's working, of course, we have to put that in quotes, because clearly, even if we're doing these things, it's not moving the needle. And it's not terribly surprising why. There are some really significant challenges that are built into all of these different initiatives. So for the annual engagement surveys, they're very valuable. They provide some very important insights to organizations, yet at the same time, engagement changes more than once a year. And running the annual engagement survey could give you an understanding of what's happening with engagement every December, but not necessarily what's happening with engagement over the course of the year. In addition, there is the challenge of survey fatigue. As we know that when surveys are extremely long or employees don't believe that the data and the feedback that they're providing is going to be used for anything, it actually has the potential to lead to disengagement, which is a terribly ironic outcome. All right, so some of these challenges to the annual engagement surveys are fairly obvious to people, and that's why frequent pulse surveys have become more popular. These are much shorter, they're run more frequently, and the big advantage is that they probably provide a more holistic and realistic view of what's happening with engagement at an organization. The problem here is that running pulse surveys by themselves may give you a solid understanding of what's happening at your organization, but they don't actually do anything to address the problem. And I think that there's an assumption that once we know what the problem is, we know how to fix it. And that's a faulty assumption because fixing these things are not easy at all. Recognition tools, as I mentioned, these are my favorite. I think they're wonderful and recognition matters immensely. And so I encourage everyone to continue to use them and to find new and great ways to use them. The problem is that recognition is just a drop in the bucket. It matters, but a lot of things matter. And when organizations provide recognition tools as an engagement strategy, they're really just scratching the surface. And then finally, this is sort of from the world of agile, if you guys have heard about that, but there's now a movement based on the belief that if we get managers and their teams together more frequently, that will get people more aligned, get better understanding, and drive engagement up. I ask you, if you hate your boss, how would you feel about more meetings with him or her? So having meetings for the sake of meetings is not necessarily a fix. So before we dive in a little bit deeper, as a behavioral economist, I always like to take a moment to say, all right, let's put on our classical economics hat for a moment and just consider what we think should contribute to employee engagement, what should make an individual committed to the organization's success. And so we've listed a bunch of these ideas to the left. I think that we assume that people should realize that they're lucky to have the job, and if they have good salary and all these other sort of good things that the organization does for them, that should be enough to drive engagement. And perhaps that's right. But of course, the whole point of us being here today is why we need to emphasize would over should. So before we try to move the needle on employee engagement, we need to understand what actually is responsible for it. And so for that, we're going to turn to what I consider to be one of the gold standards of employee engagement. It's called the Gallup Q12. And over many decades, Gallup has collected a lot of data and done a lot of analysis to be able to identify the 12 most powerful predictors of employee engagement. Many of you may be familiar with these. For those of you who are not, we're going to run through them one at a time. I won't spend a lot of time on any one of these, but I just want to make sure that everybody at a minimum has a chance to see these briefly, and also you can go and look for them later. As I bring up the first one, that reminds me to tell you, you're going to see asterisks on a lot of these. I will tell you on the next slide what those asterisks mean. If any of you are actually able to predict it, then you're probably psychic. Okay, number one, I know what is expected of me at work. Number two, I have the materials and equipment I need to do my job right. 3, at work, I have the opportunity to do what I do best every day. In the last 7 days, I have received recognition or praise for doing good work. My supervisor or someone at work seems to care about me as a person. There is someone at work who encourages my development. At work, my opinion seems to count. The mission or purpose of my company makes me feel my job is important. My associates or fellow employees are committed to doing quality work. I have a best friend at work. By the way, for what it's worth, that is my favorite one. In the last 6 months, someone at work has talked with me about my progress. This last year, I have had opportunities at work to learn and grow. Okay, so as you sort of scan over all 12, you'll notice, boy, there sure are a lot of asterisks there. So what can we conclude when we count the asterisks? What ends up happening? It turns out that we have asterisks for 10 out of 12 of the items. And what does the asterisks mean? It means that these items are the result of an interaction between a boss and the team, or interactions between colleagues. It either describes those interactions directly or it describes the outcome of those interactions. So when we think about the 12 most powerful predictors of employee engagement, and when we see that 10 out of 12 of them are the result of the dynamics between a leader and the team and between teammates, then what can we conclude? That if we want to address engagement, we have to focus on manager and peer dynamics and interactions, because that's where engagement is determined. So if we want to make a difference, that's where we have to focus. And just to sort of further validate that conclusion is a very powerful stat, which shows that managers account for 70% of the variance in engagement scores. That means that who your manager is determines 70% of your engagement. If you have a good manager, your engagement is incredibly supported. And if your manager struggles, you're going to struggle with employee engagement. All right, Sylvie, we're coming up to poll question number 4. And in this case, when we're considering the importance of poor employee engagement, we would say, well, what does it lead to? Is it the loss of customers? Is it the loss of money? Is it the loss of employees, or all of the above? Again, I am thrilled to see that most of you are going with all of the above. That is, of course, the correct answer. And I hope that given our description of loss aversion earlier in this presentation, you are looking at this with a little bit of a grin, understanding that by positioning this in terms of what we stand to lose, we in fact make employee engagement seem even more meaningful and help drive the motivation to deal with it. And so hopefully you can use that tactic with your C-suite as you try to convince them to take more proactive steps, or the need to take more proactive steps to drive employee engagement. So when we were looking at some of the more common interventions earlier, one of the things that we mentioned was that a place where tools and interventions can go wrong is that they stop at the moment that they identify the problem and assume that once they provide that information to someone, that that person will then be able to fix the problem. And we knew that that, in fact, was not actually a workable solution. That if we were going to identify a problem, we also had to provide the solution. And so for us to think about how did we want to move the needle on employee engagement, we knew first and foremost that we would focus on the dynamics between leaders and teams and on the dynamics between teammates. And where we decided that we were going to start is with assessments, because we felt that we needed to get information on which to make a diagnosis before we could recommend a treatment. And so we decided to start with assessments, but we also knew that the current way that assessments like 360 assessments or feedback surveys or upward reviews, we knew that there were some assumptions baked into those existing processes that kind of violated the spirit of behavioral economics. And so we really wanted to reevaluate how these tools would work in every possible way. So the first thing that we decided was that we were focusing and only measuring things that were indicative of dynamics between managers and their teams and between colleagues, and that we wouldn't measure anything unless we knew how to help people get better at it if we were able to discover that it was, in fact, a problem. So understanding what to measure and how to measure became a really big priority for us. But then secondly, we came to a really important understanding about how most of these products on the market work today. And we thought about how they all end up in the provision of a feedback report, where usually the feedback is aggregated and provided to a manager or to someone receiving a 360-degree assessment. And the idea, of course, is that by providing people with this understanding of how they're being perceived, that that's going to help them develop into better leaders or collaborators. In reality, what we found happening was that most of these feedback reports were succeeding in making people feel terrible. It is a very human experience to overestimate how you're doing. In fact, it could be argued that we need to do that to survive. So whenever we get these kinds of feedback reports, in most cases, it's going to be disappointing for people. And the natural reaction when we see feedback that is less flattering than how we think of ourselves is to become very defensive, to find ways to discredit the feedback, and to argue it and to worry about what kind of impressions this feedback may be forming and how might it impact my career. So we knew that if in fact we wanted to drive people to get better, we had to figure out a way to provide the feedback in ways that would reduce defensiveness and actually make people want to develop, to use it to want to get better. And that if we were going to frame the feedback as criticism, that we would never succeed in that regard. Finally, a big sort of element of existing tools that we noticed was that there seemed to be kind of a mission accomplished feeling as soon as the feedback report was provided. And that is really problematic because social science tells us quite definitively that education alone is insufficient to drive behavior change. So the belief that handing a feedback report to someone would be sufficient to gain their buy-in and subsequent development, that's a mistaken belief. It needs more. Now, that isn't necessarily a mystery, and in fact, a lot of organizations will couple their assessments with live coaching. And we are, in fact, huge fans of this. We're big believers in live coaching. Coaches are able to help people process the feedback constructively and work with them over time to induce really positive change. And so when organizations can do it, we say, please do it. The problem is that live coaching is really expensive and really time consuming. And as a result, it's usually only provided to senior leaders. Our hypothesis, of course, was that junior leaders probably needed the development the most, and they were the least likely to receive it. So that to us felt like a very significant problem. So we knew that we had to find a way that we could drive development in people without providing live coaching. But we also knew that if we wanted people to actually use it, to actually engage with our development efforts, we had to make it easy and fun for them. We couldn't make it seem like it was more work. We couldn't require them to take their own initiative to visit a learning and development website. We had to figure something else out that we knew was going to help drive development. And so with all of that as our backdrop, we built a product called Compass. And I'm going to take you through the three components of Compass so that you can understand how and why it's designed this way. And so it begins with quarterly assessments because we concluded that the two most important contributors to engagement were leader and peer dynamics. We decided that we would go back and forth focusing on both leadership and collaboration. Because we didn't want people to think that this was a lot of work and kind of a pain, we made sure that every assessment we ever ran would be no longer than 12 items, would never take more than a few minutes to complete. Obviously, when we're running a leadership assessment, we're collecting feedback from the leader's direct reports. When we're running a collaboration assessment, we're collecting feedback from a person's peers and colleagues. But making this easy, we deliver the assessments via email, has helped us to get some really significant participation rates. Next comes the feedback reports, and we made a couple of really important moves here to address the issues that we brought up above, that we brought up earlier. And so the first choice was that we decided that we were going to make individual feedback reports confidential. What we did here was removed all anxiety from the entire process right up front. If people know that they are the only ones who are going to see their individual feedback report, we have taken the idea of impression management and consequences completely out of the equation and have created a level of comfort for individuals. Likewise, the research indicates that when assessment results are kept confidential, that supports a developmental mindset. When the results are not kept confidential, that leads to significantly lower development. So this was a really important decision that we made. We have also created organization level reports so that HR practitioners can understand culturally what's happening with the organization and also can see to what extent Compass is working, but we can talk about that a little bit later. And finally, when it comes to the feedback reports, hopefully we've established the importance of framing. And so this is how we frame the feedback in these feedback reports. It turns out that science confirms for us that when we receive feedback, only about half of it is actually about us. The other half is about the person providing the feedback. There's actually a scientific name for this. It's called idiosyncratic rater effect. It's very real. And so what we do up front in this feedback report is the first thing we tell people, this is not an accurate and objective measure of your performance. Actually, what this is insight into the unique needs of your particular team. Every team is going to have different needs. So this is letting you know what are the needs that your team, if filled, would have the biggest positive impact on them. And our supposition was that it would be much easier for leaders to embrace addressing the needs of their teams than to address their own deficiencies or their own weaknesses. So by framing it this way, we think that we've helped people find sort of the intrinsic motivation to actually want to improve at this. And then lastly, there's a great rule of thumb in psychology that people need to hear anywhere from 5 to 7 compliments before they can process constructive feedback. It's because we need our confidence built up before we can handle criticism. And so in these reports, we spend much more time focused on where you did extremely well before we start talking about where we can start to focus on our work together. And then finally, once we've delivered these reports, we have already established that we can't assume that that's the end of the equation. We have to find ways to drive development over time. But doing so, we had to find a scalable solution that was also going to be effective. And what we came up with was opt-out email-based coaching. The idea was that each person would be automatically enrolled, but given the opportunity to opt out to receive email-based coaching that focused on the lowest scoring item. It was going to be a weekly email over an 8-week curriculum, and each email would take 2 minutes or less to read. The idea here, again, was that if we pushed the content to people, if we made them fun to read, if we didn't make them take too long to read, that we would greatly enhance the likelihood of our success. Of course, we never believed that people were going to read every email 100%, certainly not every person. But we even accounted for that, which I'll describe in a moment. At a high level, I think for HR practitioners, this is particularly interesting. The coaching follows a very intentional arc. The arc goes as follows. The first phase of the coaching is about buy-in, convincing leaders, hey, this is why this matters and why it's important enough for you to care about. The second phase is empathy. This is what the people on your team, or this is what your colleagues experience when you behave this way versus that way. And we do that because we know that understanding how other people are being impacted is a great source of motivation for change. And finally, it's only after those two things have been achieved do we start sharing suggestions of, here are the things that you can do to start to improve. And we did this because we knew that if on week 1 we just started saying, do this and do this and do this, it would just bounce off of people's heads. Rather, we had to do the work to make them care. It's not hard work to teach people how to improve. It's hard work to get them to care to improve. And then finally, the content within the emails is an exercise in everything that we've spent the last hour talking about. There's priming, there's framing, there's self-generation effect, there's loss aversion. We use every aspect of behavioral economics techniques that we can to try to drive people's intrinsic motivation to improve and to engage with the content in meaningful ways. So let's take a look at what happened. How did we do? So the great thing about building a new product at a company like ADP is that you've got lots of people around who can test and validate your product for you. And so within ADP, Compass has now been run 6 times. And over the course of that, we've had more than 65,000 employees participate in providing feedback. We've seen a 75% voluntary participation rate, and it's trending up. which means it's improving each time we go. We think that that is the ultimate endorsement of how Compass is being viewed internally and the value that people ascribe to it. Okay, so over this time, more than 6,500 managers have received coaching. True to our Germany and Austria effect, less than 0.5% have unsubscribed from receiving the coaching. And we think that that's a huge win, obviously. We then went on to collect a lot of qualitative feedback on what the experience was like from people. And of course, I would love to share all of that with you. But at the end of the day, what do we really care about? We care about results. So did this thing work? And fortunately, I've got a pretty good answer for that. So each time we run Compass, whether it's leadership or collaboration, we run the same assessment again 6 months later. And when we do, you might remember each assessment has 12 items. We remeasure the 11 uncoached items, and we see that the scores remained the same. But then when we measured the one coached item, the scores improved by 10%. Now, I recognize that in a vacuum, 10% doesn't seem like a large number. But I assure you, and I think that this audience probably knows, in the world of leadership development, it's gigantic, especially when you consider that every week virtually there's an article in Harvard Business Review about how leadership development doesn't work and it isn't really measurable. So we seem to have accomplished both of those problems with this new design. What I will say is that the 11 uncoached items remaining unchanged serves as our control group, so we can also say that the score improvements were literally caused by the email-based coaching. And even though we recognize that not everyone is reading the coaching word for word, at the end of the day, these are the results that we've seen across real employees. And so however it is that they're consuming it, the intervention is working. One other point that I'll make is that 10% improvement goes across the entire organization. But actually, when you go down the leadership hierarchy, at the lowest level leaders within ADP, the actual improvement was 14%. And at the highest levels, people who reported into the CEO, the improvement was actually 6%. And we have experienced the same results for both leadership and collaboration, which kind of validates our approach. And then finally, I would just say, let's consider the ROI, the return on investment. We're talking about 8 emails, 2 minutes each, 16 minutes of work spread out over 8 weeks for a 10% improvement. And when we consider that we can do this and achieve this 4 times a year, we start to see how significant these approaches can be. So in conclusion, with regards to Compass and what it can tell us about our broader topic, we don't know anything about leadership that you don't also know. We are all working from the same playbook, same subject matter experts, same academic knowledge. We don't know anything about collaboration that you don't also know. And yet with Compass, we achieved some extraordinary results. But the reason we achieved these extraordinary results is because we successfully applied behavioral economics, not because we're smarter about leadership or collaboration than anybody else. And I suppose why that is so relevant for us is that if there was ever a question as to whether or not behavioral economics matters for HR, Compass has answered it pretty definitively. And so with that, as we reach the end of our time together, and before I express my immense appreciation for your taking the time to learn about this and engage with us, there's one other important thing that I want to note. With HR practitioners in particular, it is very rare that I meet someone who is not jazzed about this stuff. It makes sense that this would be interesting to you. It's all about psychology, which is part of what made HR appealing to you in the first place. And so what I would say is that you're still ahead of the curve. As much as behavioral economics has exploded into all sorts of spheres, both in business and public policy, it still hasn't exploded in HR yet. And if you go out and you read Nudge tomorrow, I promise you that you're still ahead of the curve. So I encourage you to embrace behavioral economics, learn about it as much as you can. There are so many great books out there that will teach you. I think that you'll find that it can really boost your career. To that end, if anyone is interested in behavioral economics, talking about it with us, we've provided an email where you can send your questions or your comments, and we'll try our best to get back to you. And of course, if anybody would be interested in using Compass in your own organization, we would love to hear from you. What I will say on behalf of the team that built it, we knew that if we were successful, we were going to be making people's lives better. And we have tremendous pride in the results that we've gotten. And we hope that the kind of changes that we've been able to usher into ADP is something that we can do with your organizations as well, because everybody wins. And with that, Sylvie, I just want to say thank you for your support, and I'll hand it back over to you to close out the session.
Well, thank you very much to Jordan Birnbaum and to ADP for this very informative webcast today. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. There are a number of questions here, but we will definitely pass these questions on to Jordan and to the team at ADP so that they can reach out with the answers to the questions that you've submitted. Also, if you have any further questions, please use the opportunity when we put up the exit survey to indicate your questions in there, and they'll be more than happy to reach out with the answers to that. Just a few reminders for our attendees. If you'd like to view this webcast again, the archive recording and slides will be available for up to 7 days for our free members. And of course, if you have our recertification membership, you have unlimited access to all of our archived and upcoming webcasts. All webcast credits are stored in your HR.com account. Watch for your HR.com email to arrive within 1 to 2 business days. That will contain your certification credit information. Your feedback is important to us, so do please fill in the exit survey that will pop up on your screen once this webcast has concluded. And that ends our webcast today. Enjoy the rest of your day.